Rachel's breath caught as she turned from the galley, her mind racing. The tension in the first-class cabin was palpable, passengers stealing glances, whispering amongst themselves. She had been challenged before, but never like this. Never by someone who carried himself with the quiet authority of a man who knew exactly where he belonged. And yet, she still felt the need to question him. Daniel Carter sat calmly in his seat, fingers resting lightly on the armrest, his expression unreadable. But his daughters? Their faces told the real story. Confusion, embarrassment, hurt. The kind of hurt that came from being made to feel like they had to prove they belonged somewhere they already were. Rachel swallowed, her throat dry. She had been so sure, so convinced that she was simply doing her job. But as she looked around, the realization crept in. She had made a mistake, a big one. Hell, how she could retreat, a voice cut through the cabin. "Excuse me," a businessman from a few rows back spoke, his tone firm. "I boarded right before them. You didn't check my ticket twice. Or his." He nodded toward another passenger. "Or hers." A woman in a designer dress gave Rachel a pointed look. More murmurs of agreement rippled through the cabin. Rachel's stomach twisted. That was when the captain arrived. The moment he stepped into first class, the energy shifted. His uniform was pristine, his presence authoritative. "Is there a problem here?" His gaze flickered between Rachel and Daniel. Daniel exhaled slowly, his voice controlled but cutting. "I don't know, Captain. Perhaps your crew member can explain why she felt the need to repeatedly question whether my daughters and I belong here." Silence, heavy, unforgiving. Rachel felt the weight of every gaze on her. She opened her mouth, scrambling for an explanation, an excuse, but nothing came out. Then the captain turned to her. "Miss Simmons, a word. Now." Rachel's face burned as she followed him toward the galley, her heart pounding. She had wanted control of the situation. She had lost it completely. But before we dive deeper into the story, let me know, where are you watching from? Drop a comment below, and if you're enjoying this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another one. Los Angeles International Airport, LAX, pulsed with movement. The air buzzed with a mixture of excited chatter, rolling suitcases, and the distant hum of intercom announcements directing passengers to their gates. The vast terminal, lined with gleaming glass and steel, was a crossroads of the world. Executives in sharp suits hurried to catch red-eye flights, families juggled luggage and restless children, and college students lugged overstuffed backpacks toward new adventures. Through the controlled chaos strode Daniel Carter, his presence both unassuming and commanding. At 45 years old, he had the composed confidence of a man who had built his empire from the ground up. A self-made billionaire and co-owner of Orion Airlines, Daniel had spent decades revolutionizing air travel. He could have chosen to fly on a private jet, avoiding the crowded terminals and long lines, but that wasn't his style. Unlike many in his position, Daniel preferred anonymity. He found power in observation, watching, learning, experiencing what everyday travelers went through. If he wanted his airline to be the best, he had to understand the real customer experience, without the filter of special treatment. Today was no different. Beside him, his twin daughters, Ava and Maya, bounced with anticipation. At 13 years old, they were at the perfect age. Old enough to grasp the depth of the world, yet still young enough to be wide-eyed with wonder. Their long braids swayed as they walked, their backpacks, one splashed with vibrant graffiti designs, the other neatly organized with school supplies, bounced against their shoulders. Wasn't just a vacation, it was a journey of learning. For Ava, the history lover, it was a chance to stand where revolutions had been fought and walk the halls of the Louvre, where the world's greatest stories were captured in brushstrokes and marble. For Maya, the artist, it was a dreamland of inspiration, an entire city where architecture and street art merged in perfect harmony. Daniel had planned this meticulously, a mix of history, culture, and personal growth. He wanted them to see the world beyond their own, to understand how people lived, how history shaped nations, and how different perspectives created the tapestry of humanity. And yet, before their adventure even began, A different kind of lesson was waiting for them, a lesson about assumptions, prejudice, and the unspoken barriers that still existed, even for those who had earned their place. The moment they approached the first-class boarding area, Daniel noticed her. Rachel Simmons. She was standing by the gate podium, scanning passengers with a practiced eye, greeting some with effortless charm while others received only cursory nods. She had worked in the airline industry for nearly 2 decades, priding herself on her ability to maintain the exclusivity of first class. And then her gaze landed on them. Her posture stiffened. A flicker of disbelief flashed across her features before she quickly masked it with professionalism. A black man? 2 young black girls? First class? Rachel's mind went into silent calculation. Something felt off to her. They didn't fit the profile she expected in first class. The meticulously polished business executives, the elegantly dressed socialites, the jet-setting elites who looked the part. Her subtle prejudice took form in the smallest details, the slight narrowing of her eyes, the quick adjustment of her uniform, the way her fingers tightened around the scanner. As they reached the gate, she offered no warm welcome. Instead, her voice took on that polite but frosty tone that only those who had experienced it before would recognize. "Boarding passes, please." Daniel, unfazed, handed them over. Rachel took the passes and scanned them once. Then she scanned them again. She glanced up, her eyes flickering over Ava's hoodie and Maya's sneakers, as if expecting something more refined. She hesitated. Her thumb hovered over the screen, then her lips pressed together before she spoke. "Are you sure you're in the right line?" Ava and Maya froze. It wasn't outright hostility, it wasn't overt racism. It was something more insidious, more exhausting, the immediate doubt, the questioning of belonging, the implication that they didn't fit. Daniel held her gaze, his expression unreadable. He had encountered this exact moment more times than he cared to count. Still, his voice was measured, calm, but firm. "Yes, we are. Is there a problem?" Rachel hesitated again, her grip tightening on the scanner. She could feel the weight of the moment. If she pushed further, if she questioned them outright, she might cause a scene. She might look bad. But still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Reluctantly, she handed the passes back. "You're clear to board," she said, her voice clipped. But as they stepped forward, Daniel could feel her eyes still on them, watching, waiting, searching for something, anything, to confirm the assumption she had already made, the assumption that they didn't belong. And that was only the beginning. As they stepped onto the plane, Ava and Maya's eyes lit up with excitement. The first-class cabin was unlike anything they had ever experienced. Spacious, elegant, almost surreal. The seats were arranged in a way that gave passengers privacy, each one reclining into a near-flat bed. Touchscreen monitors gleamed in front of them, neatly folded blankets rested on plush cushions, and the air smelled of clean leather and subtle luxury. This wasn't just a flight, it was an experience. Emily Foster, one of the flight attendants, noticed the girls' expressions and smiled warmly. "First time flying first class?" she asked, her tone genuinely friendly. Maya nodded eagerly. "Yes, this is amazing." Emily chuckled. "Well, you're in for a treat. Let me know if you need anything, okay?" Her warmth immediately put them at ease, a stark contrast to the cold skepticism Rachel had shown at the gate. But Rachel wasn't done watching them. From the moment they entered, she tracked their every move. The way Maya ran her fingers over the touchscreen, the way Ava adjusted her backpack at her feet. Small, natural actions that to Rachel seemed too casual for first class. As Daniel settled into his seat, Rachel approached, her expression carefully composed, but her eyes sharp with lingering doubt. "Sir," she said, her voice just a little too polite, a little too forced, "were these seats purchased, or were they upgraded?" The way she said it wasn't just a question. It was a test. A challenge. Daniel looked up from fastening his seatbelt. His gaze met hers, steady, unwavering. "They were purchased," he said smoothly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who was used to this kind of scrutiny. "Feel free to verify with the system." Rachel hesitated for a fraction of a second. She wanted to push further, to find something wrong, but she knew she had already walked a thin line at the gate. If she insisted now, it might raise questions. Questions about her, not them. So she forced a smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Of course, sir. Enjoy your flight." But even as she walked away, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Rachel moved through the first-class cabin with practiced ease, her smile warm and professional as she attended to the other passengers. A middle-aged couple received an extra blanket with a kind nod. A businessman was served his whiskey with a soft chuckle about turbulence. A young woman adjusting her designer handbag was offered a selection of premium wines, Rachel's voice light and accommodating. But when she reached Daniel and his daughters, something changed. Her posture stiffened, her movements became sharper, and the warmth in her tone disappeared, replaced by cold efficiency. "What can I get for you, sir?" she asked, her words clipped, lacking the friendliness she had given the others. Daniel looked up from his magazine, catching the difference immediately. He wasn't imagining it. He had seen this play out countless times before, in boardrooms, in hotels, in luxury restaurants where people assumed he didn't belong until they realized who he was. But here, Rachel still didn't know, and she was treating him exactly as he expected she would. "I'll have water," he said simply. Maya hesitated. "Can I have apple juice?" Rachel barely glanced at her. "We only have orange juice and cranberry," she said flatly. Maya frowned. "But I just heard you offer apple juice to that man over there." She gestured subtly toward the businessman in 2A, who was currently sipping the exact drink she had requested. Rachel's lips pressed into a thin line. "We must be out," she said, voice tight. Ava shot Maya a look, as if to say, "Drop it," but Maya wasn't stupid. She knew what was happening. Daniel, still composed, offered a polite smile, but his eyes carried a weight behind them. "Cranberry juice, then," he said, his voice smooth but firm. Rachel gave a curt nod and turned away quickly, moving down the aisle. Maya leaned toward Ava, lowering her voice. "Why does she keep looking at us like that?" Ava didn't respond immediately. Instead, she watched as Rachel went away, then turned back slightly as if to make sure they weren't causing trouble. Ava's fingers curled into a fist. She was old enough to recognize racism when she saw it. "She doesn't think we belong here," Ava muttered under her breath. Maya frowned. "But we have tickets." Ava's jaw tightened. "That doesn't matter to people like her." Meanwhile, Rachel kept moving through the cabin, but her thoughts were stuck on them. First class isn't for people like them. They're too casual, too excited, they don't fit in. They must be on a free upgrade. She didn't even realize she was gripping the tray in her hands too tightly. Rachel adjusted the cuffs of her uniform, inhaling sharply as she watched the twins settle into their seats. Every time they whispered excitedly to each other or reached for the amenities, she felt a twist of annoyance in her gut. They didn't belong here, she was sure of it. And if the system had made a mistake, it was her job to correct it. After another glance at their seats, she squared her shoulders and walked back to Daniel with deliberate steps. Standing beside his seat, she lowered her voice but kept her tone firm. "Sir, I'm sorry, but there seems to have been a mistake with your seating assignment. These seats may have been assigned incorrectly." Daniel slowly looked up from his tablet, his expression calm but his gaze sharp. Ava and Maya immediately stopped talking, sensing the shift in the air. Around them, a few passengers flicked their eyes in their direction, their curiosity piqued by the confrontation. Daniel set his tablet down with careful precision. His voice was level, but there was an unmistakable edge beneath it. "Are you suggesting that I don't belong here?" Rachel hesitated for half a second before regaining her composure. "Of course not, sir," she said quickly. "I just need to verify." "You've already verified," Daniel interrupted, his voice low but firm. "Multiple times. So tell me exactly what needs further verification." Rachel's fingers twitched at her side. She could feel the weight of eyes on her now, passengers turning their heads, whispering behind their hands. A deep voice cut through the tension. "Rachel, I've checked the manifest." Emily Foster had appeared beside her, her expression neutral but her eyes carrying a quiet warning. "There's no mistake. The tickets were purchased. Their seats are assigned correctly." Rachel stiffened, her jaw tightening. "I understand, but—" "No but," Emily said evenly. "We don't question passengers who have legitimate seats. There is no issue here." For a moment, Rachel looked like she wanted to argue. Her lips parted slightly, her gaze darting between Emily and Daniel. But the pressure of sighting watching eyes and the undeniable facts before her forced her to step back. "Very well," she muttered, her tone clipped. Without another word, she turned and strode toward the front of the cabin, her fists clenched so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Daniel exhaled slowly and turned to his daughters. "Are you both all right?" Ava gave a small nod, but Maya was staring at Rachel's retreating figure, her brows furrowed. She wasn't just doing her job, was she? Daniel's eyes darkened slightly, but his voice remained steady. "No, sweetheart, she wasn't." And just like that, a battle had been fought. But the war was far from over. Mark Benson had been following the situation from the moment Rachel first approached Daniel. A seasoned businessman in his early 50s, he had taken more first-class flights than he could count. He knew the routine. He knew the kind of passengers Rachel usually catered to with ease. And he knew that she hadn't given him, or any of the other first-class travelers, a second glance when they boarded. Yet here she was, laser-focused on a black father and his two daughters, questioning them over and over again as if their very presence was a mistake. Leaning back in his seat, Mark took a sip of his whiskey, shaking his head slightly. He had seen subtle racism before. Hell, he had probably ignored it too many times in his life. But something about this moment, about the way those two young girls had gone from excited to wary, stirred something inside him. Maybe it was the way Ava's fingers had curled into fists in her lap, or how Maya had gone completely silent, her shoulders slightly hunched, as if trying to make herself smaller. Now, Rachel was turning away from Daniel, her face tight with barely concealed frustration when Mark spoke, his voice loud enough to carry through the cabin. "Excuse me," he said, setting his glass down on the tray table. Rachel stopped mid-step and turned to face him, clearly surprised. "I couldn't help but notice something. You've been questioning this man and his daughter since they got here. Meanwhile, you didn't even look at my ticket when I boarded. Care to explain why that is?" A few nearby passengers who had been watching in uncomfortable silence now perked up, their interest sharpening. Rachel's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Mark raised an eyebrow. "I mean, if this is just about checking tickets, why didn't you check mine, or the gentleman in 3C, or that woman in 1A? You seemed perfectly fine with letting them take their seats without interrogation." He folded his arms across his chest. "So I'll ask again, what exactly made this family worth all that extra attention?" Rachel's face paled slightly. She could feel the shift in the cabin now, the way the passengers were looking at her, waiting for her response. The dynamic had changed. She was no longer in control of the situation. Daniel, still seated, slowly turned his head toward her, his expression unreadable, but his voice calm and cutting. "Tell me, Rachel," he said, each word deliberate, "what exactly about us doesn't belong here?" Rachel's throat tightened. For the first time, she was truly cornered. Her mind scrambled for an excuse, something that wouldn't make her look bad. "I was just following protocol," she mumbled, her confidence slipping for the first time all flight. Daniel tilted his head slightly, his gaze unwavering. "Are you sure about that?" Rachel swallowed hard. Well, I just wanted to be thorough. But only with us?" Ava's voice was soft, but her words sliced through the tension like a blade. Rachel flinched, ever so slightly. Silence settled over the cabin. Rachel exhaled sharply, muttering something unintelligible under her breath, before quickly turning and walking toward the front of the plane. Daniel finally leaned back into his seat, his fingers drumming lightly on the armrest. Mark took another sip of his whiskey, shaking his head. "Unbelievable," he muttered. Then he looked toward Daniel and nodded. "For what it's worth, sir, you handled that better than most would have." Daniel gave a polite nod in return. "I've had practice." Rachel was gone for now. But she wasn't done yet. Rachel stormed toward the front of the cabin, her heart pounding, her face burned with humiliation, but beneath that was something sharper: anger, resentment, and the desperate need to regain control. She had lost the moment back there, lost to a businessman who had no business interfering, lost to Daniel Carter's quiet defiance, lost to the weight of watching eyes, but she wasn't finished. Reaching the front galley, she took a deep breath and smoothed out her uniform. She needed a reason, something to justify her instincts, something that would shift the focus away from her and back onto them. Picking up the in-flight phone, she pressed a direct line to the cockpit. "Captain Reynolds, this is Rachel Simmons in first class," she said, keeping her voice steady, professional. "I need to report a possible security concern regarding passengers in 2D, 2E, and 2F. A brief pause, then his voice came through, calm but alert. "What kind of security concern?" Rachel glanced over her shoulder, lowering her tone. "There's a man in first class traveling with 2 minors. There have been inconsistencies with his seating, and when I attempted to verify his ticket, he became confrontational. Another passenger got involved as well. I just want to make sure everything is in order before we continue the flight." There. It wasn't technically a lie, but it was just enough of a distortion to plant a seed of doubt. Captain Reynolds didn't respond immediately. Then, "I'll send the lead flight attendant first to assess. Stay where you are." Rachel hung up, pressing her lips together as she exhaled. A minute later, the lead flight attendant, a tall, no-nonsense woman named Michelle Harding, approached. Unlike Rachel, Michelle had been flying long enough to know when a situation actually required escalation. "Rachel," Michelle said, arms crossed, "I just spoke to the captain. He says you reported a security concern?" Rachel nodded, keeping her expression serious. "Yes. The man in 2D, I've been trying to verify his ticket, but he keeps deflecting. When I pressed further, a passenger in 4B jumped in and created a scene. I think it's worth a second look, just to be safe." Michelle sighed. "I saw what happened, Rachel." Rachel's stomach dropped slightly. "Then you understand why I—" Michelle held up a hand. "What I understand is that you singled out a passenger, harassed his family, and now you're trying to make it a security issue because you lost control of the situation." Rachel's lips parted in protest, but Michelle wasn't finished. "We are not escalating this without cause. If there is a real concern, we follow protocol. You should know that better than anyone. But from what I've seen, this isn't about protocol, Rachel. This is about something else." Rachel swallowed, feeling trapped again, but before she could respond, the captain himself stepped into the galley. Captain Reynolds was a veteran pilot with over 25 years of experience. He wasn't the type to jump at every little report, but when his crew called in a security concern, he took it seriously. "Michelle," he said, nodding to her, then turned his sharp eyes to Rachel. "Brief me." Rachel straightened, forcing confidence into her voice. "Sir, there was an issue with a first-class passenger. He refused to cooperate when I attempted to verify his ticket. When I questioned him further, another passenger became involved. Given the circumstances, I thought it best to raise it to your attention." The captain's expression didn't change. He turned to Michelle. "Is that what happened?" Michelle didn't hesitate. "No, sir." The passenger in 2D had his tickets verified multiple times. There was no error. Rachel continued questioning him even after confirmation, and when another passenger pointed it out, she escalated the situation unnecessarily. Captain Reynolds stared at Rachel for a long, uncomfortable moment. Then, without a word, he turned and walked straight into first class. Passengers straightened in their seats as the captain appeared, his uniform crisp, his posture commanding. Daniel looked up as he approached, his expression unreadable. Ava and Maya stiffened, watching. Mark Benson sat back in his seat, arms crossed, waiting to see how this would go. Captain Reynolds stopped in front of Daniel's seat, his hands clasped behind his back. "Mr. Carter," he said evenly, "I've been informed there was a problem." Daniel met his gaze. "Not from my end." The captain nodded slowly. "You and your daughters are traveling on fully paid first-class tickets?" "Yes," Daniel replied simply. The captain turned to Michelle, who gave a firm nod. There was a long, tense silence. Then the captain exhaled through his nose, slowly turning toward Rachel, who was standing just behind him, looking noticeably paler than before. "Mr. Carter and his daughters will remain exactly where they are," Captain Reynolds said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Then, with a sharp glance at Rachel, he added, "Rachel, I need to see you in the galley, now." Rachel's entire body went stiff. Daniel, calm as ever, simply leaned back in his seat and picked up his tablet again. Maya glanced at Ava. Ava glanced at their father. And then, for the first time since boarding, they smiled. Rachel turned stiffly and walked toward the galley, her movements mechanical, her face blank, but inside, she was boiling. The murmurs from first class didn't stop as she passed. She could feel the weight of their judgment, the way some passengers avoided her gaze while others openly stared. Her entire body was tense, her heart pounding. She had been humiliated, in front of passengers, in front of her colleagues, in front of the captain. And worst of all, she had no way to spin this in her favor. As soon as she reached the galley, she gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles turning white. She sucked in a sharp breath, trying to calm the fury twisting inside her chest. How had this happened? She had been doing her job. She had been protecting the integrity of first class. Wasn't that what she was supposed to do? But the moment she tried to justify it, a sickening realization gnawed at her. Would I have done this if they had looked different? The question hit harder than she wanted to admit. She clenched her jaw, forcing herself to push it aside. No, she had just been cautious, diligent, that was all. But deep down, in a place she wasn't ready to acknowledge, she knew that wasn't the truth. Meanwhile, back in the cabin, Ava and Maya finally exhaled. Their shoulders slumped slightly, releasing a tension neither of them had realized they were holding. Maya was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. "Dad?" Daniel, still composed, turned to her. She hesitated, glancing toward the front where Rachel had disappeared. "Did we do something wrong?" Daniel reached over and placed a steady hand on hers. "No," he said firmly, "you did nothing wrong. Some people will always question your place, but that doesn't mean you don't belong." Ava, who had been staring down at her lap, looked up at him, her eyes clouded with emotion. "Then why does it feel like we have to prove it?" Daniel's expression softened, but there was something unshakable in his gaze. "Because the world isn't always fair," he admitted. "But you don't change who you are just to fit someone else's idea of where you should be." Maya swallowed hard, processing his words. Then Emily appeared beside them, holding 2 small plates. Without a word, she placed a warm, freshly baked cookie on each twin's tray table. Maya blinked. "What's this for?" Emily smiled. "Because first class isn't just about the seat, it's about the experience." She winked. "And you two deserve a good one." Ava and Maya exchanged a glance before small smiles tugged at the corners of their lips. Rachel, still in the galley, sat down on a small crew seat, arms crossed, eyes unfocused. For the first time, she wondered if she had been the one in the wrong all along. As the plane touched down in Paris, the tension that had simmered throughout the flight lingered like a heavy fog. Daniel remained outwardly calm, but his mind was already working. He had experienced this kind of treatment before, a quiet, insidious kind of discrimination that was easy to deny but impossible to ignore. This time, however, his daughters had been subjected to it firsthand, and that was unacceptable. As soon as they disembarked, Daniel led Ava and Maya through the terminal, ensuring they had their luggage, before directing them toward a quiet lounge area near the baggage claim. "Stay here for a few minutes," he told them, offering a reassuring smile. "I just have something I need to take care of." Ava and Maya nodded, though the weight of the experience still lingered in their eyes. Daniel walked toward an Orion Airlines customer service desk, his presence commanding but composed. The uniformed agent at the counter barely had time to greet him before he placed his black elite membership card onto the desk. The agent's eyes widened slightly as he picked it up, immediately recognizing the executive tier status. "Good evening, Mr. Carter. How can I assist you?" Daniel leaned in slightly, his tone even but firm. "I need to file a formal complaint regarding a crew member on Orion Flight 72 from Los Angeles. The issue requires immediate attention." The agent straightened, his professionalism kicking in. "Of course, sir. If you could provide the details." Daniel recounted everything, from the initial skepticism at the gate, to the relentless questioning, to Rachel's final failed attempt to escalate the situation. The agent's fingers moved swiftly across the keyboard as he logged every detail. "Would you like this complaint to be flagged for corporate review?" the agent asked. Daniel's eyes hardened slightly. "Yes." The agent hesitated for a brief moment, his gaze flicking to the name on the membership card before realization dawned. The subtle shift in his posture, straightening just a little more, his voice tightening with precision, told Daniel everything he needed to know. The agent now understood exactly who he was speaking to. "I will escalate this to senior management immediately," the agent confirmed, his voice carrying a new layer of urgency. "You'll receive a follow-up within the next 24 hours. Daniel gave a curt nod. "Good." Without another word, he turned and walked back toward his daughters. Noticing how Maya was quietly sketching in her notebook while Ava scrolled through her phone. They had already started compartmentalizing the experience, tucking it away the way black children were often forced to do. Daniel exhaled slowly. Not this time. This time, something would be done. Halfway across the world, at Orion Airlines headquarters in New York, Michael Roberts sat in his glass-walled office, finishing his late-night emails when his phone buzzed with an urgent notification. A formal complaint had been flagged for immediate corporate review. His eyes scanned the details. Then he saw the name. Daniel Carter. Michael sat up straighter, a sharp wave of understanding hitting him immediately. This wasn't just any passenger. Within minutes, he had forwarded the complaint to Human Resources, the chief of in-flight operations, and the head of employee conduct. By morning, Rachel Simmons would receive a summons for a disciplinary hearing. Rachel walked into the Orion Airlines corporate office with her shoulders squared, her chin slightly raised, and a carefully rehearsed defense running through her mind. She had barely slept the night before, oscillating between frustration, disbelief, and a creeping sense of dread. The email she had received at dawn had been short and cold. Report to headquarters for a disciplinary hearing. Immediate compliance required. Now, as she stepped into the sterile, glass-walled conference room, she spotted 3 people already seated at the long, polished table. At the center sat Michael Roberts, Senior Vice President of Operations, his suit crisp, his expression unreadable. To his right was Natalie Green, the airline's Chief of Employee Conduct, reviewing a folder of printed documents. On his left sat James Patel, Head of In-Flight Services, tapping a pen against the table. Rachel took the empty chair at the far end, forcing herself to maintain a neutral expression. Michael set his pen down, interlacing his fingers. "Miss Simmons," he began, his tone devoid of warmth, "do you know why you're here?" Rachel folded her hands in her lap. "I assume it's about the passenger complaint from Flight 72. Michael tilted his head slightly. "Passenger complaint?" His voice carried an edge of amusement, but his eyes were sharp. "That's an interesting way to phrase it." Rachel held her ground. "I was doing my job. I was ensuring the integrity of our first-class cabin. I had reason to verify the seating arrangement of a particular passenger and his children." Michael leaned forward, cutting her off. "Do you know who Daniel Carter is?" Rachel blinked. Something in his tone made her pause, her carefully prepared defense fracturing slightly. He was a first-class passenger on that flight, she said slowly. Michael exhaled, shaking his head. No, Miss Simmons. Daniel Carter is one of the principal owners of Orion Airlines. Rachel went completely still. For a moment, the room was dead silent, save for the faint ticking of a clock on the far wall. Her breath hitched as the full weight of those words settled into her chest. One of the owners. Michael let the moment stretch before speaking again, his voice edged with controlled disappointment. Mr. Carter filed a formal complaint detailing your conduct. Since then, we've reviewed multiple passenger testimonies, examined the flight manifest, and, most importantly, looked into your history. Rachel's palms started to sweat. We found a pattern, Natalie Green said, flipping through the file in front of her. Over the past 5 years, you have received multiple informal complaints about your treatment of first-class passengers, particularly passengers of color. You've been spoken to before, you've been given chances to correct your approach. Rachel's mouth went dry. That's not fair. I treat all passengers equally. James Patel gave a short, humorless laugh. Do you? He slid a report across the table. Because based on this data, you're 3 times more likely to randomly verify the tickets of Black and Latino passengers in first class than anyone else. Rachel's stomach twisted into knots. Michael exhaled, rubbing his temple. Miss Simmons, this airline has 0 tolerance for discriminatory behavior. You embarrass not just a passenger, not just a respected businessman, but a man who helped build this company. And more than that, you sent a message to an entire first-class cabin to 2 young girls that people like them don't belong. That is completely unacceptable. Rachel swallowed hard, her throat constricting with panic. Michael's tone turned final, absolute. Effective immediately, you are suspended without pay. Rachel's eyes widened. Wait. He held up a hand, silencing her. You will be required to complete comprehensive sensitivity and anti-bias training. If you fail to complete the program successfully, your employment with Orion Airlines will be terminated. There will be no second chances. Rachel felt her entire world tilt beneath her. Fired? After almost 20 years in the airline industry? Her mind raced for an argument, a defense, something to grasp onto, but she found nothing. Michael leaned back in his chair, watching as the reality sank into her features. You may leave, he said simply. Rachel sat there, stunned, before slowly rising to her feet. She forced herself to keep her head high as she walked out of the conference room, but her hands were shaking. For the first time, she understood. She had spent years making people like Daniel Carter and his daughters feel like they didn't belong. Now she was the one being shown the door. Weeks had passed since the incident on Flight 72, and life had settled back into its usual rhythm. Daniel had returned to work, overseeing new expansions for Orion Airlines, while Ava and Maya had dived back into school, their trip to Paris now just another collection of stories shared with friends. But some things lingered. Maya still sketched scenes from their travels, but every so often she would go back to that moment on the plane, the tightness in her chest, the weight of Rachel's stare, the quiet anger of being questioned just for existing where they were supposed to be. One evening, as Daniel sat in his home office reviewing reports, Elizabeth, his wife, appeared in the doorway holding a letter. "This came for you," she said, her voice carrying a note of curiosity. Handwritten, no return address. Daniel took the envelope, immediately recognizing the neat, formal handwriting. He didn't have to open it to know who it was from. Rachel Simmons. He exhaled slowly, breaking the seal and unfolding the letter. "Mr. Carter, I don't expect forgiveness, but I need to say this. It was wrong. At the time, I told myself I was just doing my job, following protocol. I convinced myself that I was being thorough, that my actions were about maintaining order, not about you personally. But the truth is, I wasn't just following protocol. I was following assumptions I didn't even realize I had, and in doing so, I hurt you, I hurt your daughters. I humiliated myself in front of my colleagues. And worse, I let my bias blind me to what was right in front of me, a father traveling with his children just like any other passenger. The weeks since that flight have been difficult but necessary. The training I was required to take forced me to confront truths I didn't want to face. It forced me to look at my past behavior, to recognize patterns I had ignored, and for the first time, I understood that my discomfort, my skepticism, wasn't about safety or rules, it was about control. It was about an unconscious belief that I had the right to decide who belonged and who didn't, and I was wrong. I don't know if an apology changes anything. I don't know if it erases the way your daughters felt that day, but I needed to tell you that I see it now, and I am working to be better. Rachel Simmons. Daniel read the letter twice, letting each word settle. He wasn't easily moved by apologies, especially ones that only came after consequences. But there was something about this one. It wasn't defensive. It wasn't sugar-coated. It wasn't for public relations or damage control. It was raw, personal. Maya appeared in the doorway, watching him. "What is it?" she asked, tilting her head. Daniel handed her the letter, watching as she and Ava read it together on the couch. When they finished, Maya frowned, thoughtful. "Do you think she really means it?" Daniel leaned back in his chair. "Time will tell," he said simply. "But people can change if they want to." At Orion Airlines corporate headquarters, a memo had been sent to every department, every crew member, every executive. Effective immediately, all flight personnel will undergo enhanced anti-discrimination training. This training is not optional. It is not a formality. It is a commitment to ensuring that every passenger, regardless of race, background, or appearance, is treated with the respect they deserve. We are in the business of service, and service begins with dignity. Treat every passenger with respect. You never know who they are. In training sessions across the country, flight attendants sat through uncomfortable but necessary conversations. Videos of past incidents were shown, passenger testimonials were read, hard questions were asked. Rachel, now reinstated but forever changed, sat in the front row, listening. Because this time she was truly ready to learn. A year had passed since that flight, since Rachel's scrutiny, since the confrontation that had forced a company to look at itself more closely. Life had moved forward. Daniel had returned to work, continuing to expand Orion Airlines into new international markets. Ava and Maya had grown in ways even they didn't realize, a little more aware, a little more observant, a little more sure of their place in the world. The experience had not broken them, it had sharpened them. Now, Daniel found himself at the airport once again, this time alone, dressed in his usual understated elegance, a well-fitted jacket, dark slacks, nothing flashy. He approached the first-class check-in counter where an attendant greeted him with a professional but warm smile. No hesitation, no second glances. His ticket was processed smoothly, his boarding pass handed back with a simple, "Enjoy your flight, Mr. Carter." He made his way to the gate, listening absently to the conversations around him. The hum of business travelers checking emails, the laughter of a honeymooning couple, the excited chatter of children heading to new destinations. It was a routine flight to New York, nothing remarkable. And yet, something caught his attention as he waited to board. A young black family approached the first-class lane. A father, mother, and their little girl, no older than 6. The girl wore a bright pink hoodie, gripping a small stuffed elephant in one hand as she bounced on her heels, her excitement barely contained. Daniel watched closely, his grip tightening slightly around the boarding pass in his hand. Would it happen again? Would someone stop them? Would someone question them? The gate agent looked up and smiled. "Good evening, welcome aboard." No hesitation, no scrutiny, no pause as the tickets were scanned. The little girl tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mommy, are we really sitting in first class?" The mother laughed softly, stroking her daughter's hair. "Dear baby, we are." As they walked past Daniel, he caught the father's eye for a brief moment, a brief, unspoken acknowledgement. Daniel exhaled slowly, a quiet smile forming on his lips. Change was happening. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic. It was in these small, ordinary moments, the moments where no one had to prove they belong. As he boarded the plane and settled into his seat, he saw the flight attendants move through the cabin, greeting passengers. They were professional, welcoming, treating every traveler with the same quiet respect. Rachel wasn't there. He had no idea if she still worked for Orion Airlines, and truthfully, he didn't care. This was bigger than her. This was about a system adjusting itself, about policies turning into real action, about future generations not having to fight the same exhausting battles. He gazed out the window as the plane taxied down the runway, the engines roaring to life. The past year had proven something important. Change wasn't just possible, it was inevitable. And sometimes, the greatest power move was simply watching the world catch up to the truth you had always known. As the plane soared through the sky, Daniel closed his eyes for a brief moment, letting the quiet hum of the engines settle around him. The past year had been a testament to something he had always believed. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it happens. It happens when people refuse to let injustice slide. It happens when silence is broken. It happens when those in power are forced to listen. His daughters had seen the world differently after that flight. Ava had become sharper, more aware of how people treated her in certain spaces. Maya had used her art to process what had happened, sketching scenes that captured both the weight of that experience and the hope that had followed. They had learned a hard lesson that day, but they had also learned something even more important: how to hold their heads high even when the world tried to shrink them. And Rachel? He didn't know where she was now, but he liked to think that maybe, just maybe, she had truly changed. That she had taken a long, uncomfortable look at herself and decided to be better, not because she had been forced to, but because she had chosen to. Change is a choice. The kind of choice that flight attendants make when they decide to treat every passenger with dignity. The kind of choice that a corporation makes when it prioritizes accountability over silence. The kind of choice that a person makes when they challenge their own biases instead of defending them. But what about you? How would you have reacted if this happened to you? Have you ever been judged unfairly? Have you ever been made to feel like you didn't belong, even when you did? Let us know in the comments. Your voice matters. Because at the end of the day, this isn't just about one flight, one family, or one mistake. It's about something bigger. Never judge someone by their appearance. The person you look down on today might own the company tomorrow. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories of courage and change. Every voice matters, and every story has the power to open eyes, challenge assumptions, and reshape the way we see the world. Together, we can create a world where dignity isn't a privilege, it's a right. Where respect isn't conditional, it's automatic. Where no one has to prove they belong, because belonging should never be questioned in the first place. Change starts with awareness. It grows through conversation, and it becomes unstoppable when people like you refuse to stay silent. So tell us, what's your story? Have you ever faced a moment where you had to stand your ground, challenge bias, or demand the respect you deserve? Share your experience in the comments. Let's keep this conversation going, because the more we talk about it, the more we make change real. Thank you for watching, thank you for being part of this journey, and remember, treat people right, because you never know whose life you're shaping with a single moment of kindness or a single act of prejudice.